Yokai, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I think let's do that. So thanks everyone for joining us for this really exciting panel today. Just one or two quick housekeeping notes before we dive in. One, this is being recorded so that we can share all the amazing words of wisdom and insights that we hear today with those who aren't able to make it. And two, please ask questions. So there's a Q&A function. Please direct your questions there, and we'll do our best to get to them after we have a little bit of discussion with the panel. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Janine.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Janine Abrams-McClain, and I'm the Vice President at Fair Count. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that was founded by Stacey Abrams. Fair Count is committed to long-term power building in historically undercounted, marginalized, and disenfranchised communities. And we do this through continued civic engagement, including the census, voting, and redistricting. But at the core of everything that we do, we have a deep commitment to equity, equitable power, resources, and access to information. In our work, we draw a straight line from communities being undercounted in the census and underrepresented at the polls to those same communities being overlooked and over-resourced throughout this pandemic. That under-resourcing, which most acutely affects rural, Black, Latinx, and Native American communities, includes a lack of digital infrastructure, which leads to limited online connectivity to schedule doctor's appointments, to complete schoolwork, to work from home or to start a business, or to get accurate information about the pandemic and the vaccines. When we started our 2020 census efforts at Fair Count, it became clear to us that many of the communities we worked in had limited or no internet access. And statistically, that's about at least 20% of Georgia households. This was both a challenge for completing the first census that was primarily conducted online, and it was also another example of how these communities have been shortchanged in resources and infrastructure. So we decided to bring it directly to these communities. Through Fair Count's Technology Innovation Program, our organizers identified rural community hubs and installed Wi-Fi hotspots in locations like churches, barbershops, community centers, farm worker health clinics, libraries, and more. Throughout, more than 160 hotspots were installed, and we provided iPads or Chromebooks in need of hardware, along with a guarantee to pay for the data through the year to come. During the pandemic, these sites became hubs for local students to attend school and do homework. They were places where community members could apply for state and federal benefits. And they were resources that allowed rural faith institutions to stay connected to their congregations as in-person worship ended. We are continuing this work in 2021 because we believe that the communities deserve equitable access to the internet. As you can imagine, I was ecstatic when I learned about Connect Humanity and their goal to provide meaningful internet access for across the globe. Their plan is innovative, bold, and based in research. I joined Connect Humanity's Advisory Council because they understand that closing the digital divide is a complex problem that doesn't have a single solution. They understand that we need to use every single tool in the toolbox. And they understand that the strategies and solutions implemented can't be short-sighted. We need long-term solutions for these communities. I'm excited about the work that the community has done, and I cannot wait to see what they'll do next. And with that, I will turn it over to Yokai.
Thank you so much, Janine, for those kind words, for your partnership, and for co-sponsoring this event. And thank you also to the Humanity United, Truist Bank Foundation, the World Economic Forum, who are sort of our early partners in getting the work of Connect Humanity started. My name is Yochai Ben-Avi. I'm privileged to be the CEO of Connect Humanity. We're a new global fund that supports, catalyzes, and scales solutions to bring meaningful internet access to all. And we do this in a few ways. We do this through philanthropic grants, through low interest loans, conducting research, advocacy, and field building. As Janine was talking about, we believe in solving this problem holistically. And so that includes supporting projects in 5 interrelated areas. The first is infrastructure, right? We need to get the internet to people and to underserved communities. which are disproportionately communities of color. Um, the second area of our focus is around affordability and trying to make the internet actually accessible and within reach to people. And we believe that there's a lot of power in cataloging new business models to support those who have not traditionally been served. The third area for us is around skill building. That's both digital literacy, sort of helping people to know how to use the internet and use devices to improve their lives, find access about COVID or access their jobs, but also about building network engineering talent to literally go build the internet in communities around the world. And the fourth is that like locally relevant content, like how, people need to see the value in using the internet and also to, use the internet to improve their lives. And finally, and you can, is policy. And you can tell that I'm a wonk because I'm like sitting here in a blazer, but I think there's a lot of things that regulators can do to actually accelerate the rate at which people are connecting. So you can learn more about what Connect Humanity is and what we're up to at connecthumanity.fund. But ultimately, what I hope you take away is that we aim to support and empower an open community of practice backed by the capital to finally solve the problem of bringing all the internet to all people all the time, as my friend Anna would say. And I think what the pandemic has shown us is that the consequences of being unconnected have never been more serious. What's at stake here is, kids losing a year or more of education, millions falling into poverty, people being unable to get accurate information about the COVID-19 pandemic, where to get help, where to get tested, where to get a vaccine. And I don't think that this is a temporary thing. I think that this is, an acceleration, this shift to remote work and online learning and telehealth that we've seen over the last year and change is an acceleration of a digitization that's already been occurring for years. And if we don't act, we are at risk of billions continue to fall further behind just by staying where they are. And I think, it's tempting to sometimes throw out this big number, like 3.6 billion people and connected to the internet. And if we, look at sort of who is connected, that number is actually probably even bigger, if we count people who are on, let's say, 2G connections or slower connections that don't let them fully participate in the digital economy. But I think we also have to who is unconnected. We hear in the United States something like 33 to 40% of Latinos don't have access. Up to a third of Black Americans lack access. And when we talk about the unconnected, these are folks who are sort of already struggling. And this disparity in internet access is a further challenge for racial equity. And so I think, we're really glad to bring people, a fantastic group of experts together today to really dive into this and talk about what are the consequences of this disparity in internet access and what can be done about it. And I think it's, we believe it's important to really center this discussion on the experiences of communities of color, which is why I'm so excited that we can be joined today by Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean, the VP of Fair Count, who you already heard from, Brenda Victoria Castillo, the CEO of the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Matt Rantanen, who has like probably the coolest LinkedIn title. He's the cyber warrior for tribal broadband, but more formally, he's the director of technology at the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, doing partnering and business development for Arcadian Infracom, and the co-chair of the Tech and Telecom Subcommittee at the National Congress of American Indian. And Raymond Pund, who's a librarian in California and the VP of the Asian Pacific American Libraries Association. So thank you all. If we were in person, I would say like, let's give a round of applause, but it feels weird over Zoom. So maybe to kick off, I just want to ask all of our panelists by way of introduction, if you could share sort of a short story about how you're seeing the consequences of the lack of affordable, reliable internet access playing out in your communities. And maybe Brenda, we can start with you. You're on mute, Brenda.
Sorry about that, but thank you, Yohai. Long before COVID-19, the digital divide for the Latino community already existed. So we were already at a disadvantage when it came to getting education, finding jobs, receiving medical care, engaging in the democratic process. We talked about statistics, Yohai, and according to the recent US Census, 38.6% of Hispanic households lack meaningful internet access. 58% of Latino parents feel online schoolwork has been difficult because of technical problems, such as websites or programs not working. And 83% of Latino families are worried that their children are falling behind school. And I so agree with that. I think we've all seen the heartbreaking photo, the picture of the two little girls sitting outside of a Taco Bell in Salinas, California, hoping to use the Wi-Fi to complete their homework. This really became an image that burned not only in my mind, but everyone's minds, that what it means to be a young person right now, a student, and whose family is struggling to pay for the internet at home. But more than that, I think what truly I feel the media did not talk about in that photo, in that piece, that story, is that those two little girls were a part of an immigrant farm working community. And not only were they struggling with access to internet, but they were also struggling with access to housing, healthcare, food security, you name it. When we talk about this being a dire issue for our community, that is what we're talking about. The fact that not only is it an education inequity to not have access to the internet at home, but no parent should have to make the decision to choose to put food on the table, a roof over their head, or pay an internet bill. And then there are the long-term effects. So when a young student does not have internet access at home, they fall behind school, right? So then they're unlikely to score high in a college entrance exam. So are they actually going to go to attend college? And if they're not, are they going to have to settle for a lower paying entry level job, which means a lack of access to good healthcare? I don't know if that job would have healthcare, to owning their own home. On a personal note, my grandfather received an elementary school education. My father received a high school education, and I myself received a college education, and my son will graduate next year with a master's. So for Latinos, education is everything. That is how we move up generationally. We can't fight for the next generation to progress without access to resources, which is now the internet access. Listen, Latinos, we're very hardworking. We don't mind working hard. I myself went to USC, but I also worked full-time the whole time I was there. So imagine that, working full-time and going to school full-time. So we don't shy away from hard work. But what we absolutely expect is that we have the same opportunities to access affordable, quality broadband access so our children can get that education. And that is why the National Hispanic Media Coalition would emphasize that digital rights are human rights. Racial justice only occurs when institutions give equal opportunities to all people, which means that there will not be equality in our country until every human being is connected.
Thanks, Brenda. And I think, that story is so powerful, both your personal story on education, but also that heartbreaking story of, the two girls in Salinas and the Taco Bell. I think it really sort of drives home the human cost of this. Matt, maybe I can ask you to share sort of a story from your communities and the communities you sort of work with that's really sort of highlight the consequences here.
Sure. So, I guess just to set some baseline, and some of the things we've heard lately is, why is there so much money coming out that's to support tribal broadband? And there's a lot of people out there that think that, there are people already building this stuff for everyone. So let's focus elsewhere on getting them access to this and affordability. But in reality, in the Indian reservation scope of the United States, we're sovereign dependents of the federal government, and the resources were supposed to be delivered to the reservations where tribes were forced to live in the past, and continue to have communities in those locations today and thrive as sovereign nations today. But through so many incentives and so many subsidies, the U.S. government has failed to actually get that to tribes. So what we're seeing is during COVID, everybody went home for about a week, and the entire system tried to figure out how it was going to operate. And they decided to do school online in our communities, and all of our kids, at least in Southern California, bus off of the reservation to a county school. And they reached out to try to tell everybody that they were going to be online school, and they actually couldn't even get a hold of some of the kids because there was no cell coverage at their home. They didn't have broadband access, and the parents were struggling trying to manage other COVID efforts. So it was a mess for a couple of weeks to try to get everybody on board, getting them in school online. I worked with the County Office of Education and some of the regional school districts, as their tech people were reaching out to me saying, hey, we're giving out these hotspots in some of the communities where we know the Tribal Digital Village Network is, and the kids are giving them back saying that this doesn't work in where we live, so can we do something else? And what do you mean the cell stuff, the cell towers don't work where you live? How does that work? And I said, well, do yourself a favor, take one of your hotspots and drive around your communities of where you're serving children that bus to your school and see what we're talking about. And so one of the IT guys for one of the districts took off in his car with his little hotspots, and he drove around, and he realized, what a deficit the tribal children were in, just trying to attend their schools. And so it just kind of like went like an earthquake shockwave through the different minds of the people that were in charge of serving these children. And the kids were completely like nonchalant about it. They were kind of like, yeah, we don't have cell service here. You know that? Yeah, we don't have broadband either, because one reason or another. The take rate ahead of COVID was not as high as you would expect it to be, even in areas where there is opportunity to get connected to the Tribal Digital Village. As soon as COVID hit, the laundry list of people, like 500 homes deep, are ready to get internet connected to their house. Then you're in the problem of how do we deploy during COVID without becoming the spreader of the disease, right? How do we operate properly, going in and out of somebody's house to do an installation? What are what kind of respect do we have to build there, and the structures do we have to build there for safety? And then each individual sovereign nation operates as its own government, and should, and has different rules. So then how do we operate on this reservation versus that reservation? And the challenges that just came before us to deal with that were monumental.
Thanks, Matt. Looking forward to diving in more to hear how you're actually able to do that. But before we go on, I want to flip it over to Ray and hear a little bit more. Maybe there's an anecdote of a couple tweets length you could share with us. And I do want to remind folks that you can ask questions in the Q&A tool. Ray, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to add, building on the remarks that were shared earlier, that libraries play a fundamental role in providing access. I think we all know this. There are many types of libraries.
I don't think we all know this. I think this is important.
Okay.
Tell us how.
So yeah, happy to dive into that. And there are also many different types of libraries. The ones we're most familiar with are public libraries, the ones that support the communities, whether they're in urban, suburban, or rural. They're academic libraries supporting faculty and students, special libraries and legal, medical, and government, prison libraries, and school libraries, right? So forth. Reason why I'm sharing all of this is because there's a nuance of different types of libraries that provide similar services, but focusing on their communities. And so for this panel discussion, I'm going to highlight more on the public library aspect. Having worked at a public library before and providing technology training, it's quite eye-opening to see how all of these assets can impact our communities, right? Supporting their needs. And as a result, I know that people who choose not to have the internet for whatever reason may be reliant on their public libraries to save money or to also feel like they're connected to the greater community through their public libraries. However, that doesn't mean that the public libraries can do this alone. They're actually quite constrained in terms of resources. So for example, I had done some research last year looking at how, right before COVID, how digital divide impacts communities of color in Central Valley in California. So there was one participant in this study named Ben, who was the first American Hmong generation living in the Central Valley. And I think what I found out was they're relying on the public libraries to get them access to apply for healthcare, for jobs, for getting new opportunities. However, for his family and his communities, I think the issue is a linguistic barrier. That's something that has created a lot of challenges for the Asian and Asian American communities, because there's that linguistic component where the web is heavily focused in English, primarily in English. And how do you get into these different languages where people can feel comfortable in accessing and navigating the web? So like, I think that is something we need to think about. How do we continue to support libraries to provide resources to expand and partner and providing such services? I think we know that libraries want to serve people and support them. People are dependent on them, but libraries do need resources themselves. And that includes operating costs like opening and closing hours, safety nets, trainings, personnel, hiring and retaining people who speak languages to engage with their communities. And so these providing access also has a lot of constraints too, right? You have to think about these other issues. But right now, because of COVID, we're seeing that libraries, just like many other community institutions, have closed down. And as a result, some of them had to open up their parking lots to extend the Wi-Fi, because then there are cars that can go in and use the internet safely through the parking lot. And people aren't able to go in physically, but some libraries have also partnered with schools to lend out hotspots and community organizations, right? Like what Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean shared earlier with Fair Count, right? Doing these partnerships is key here, but it also indicates that it's such a challenging issue that everyone needs to work on it collectively. And I'll leave this one anecdote that some libraries have also expanded their mobile services. So there are vans going to rural communities, such as parts in Central Valley, in providing Wi-Fi hubs for the communities. But they can't do this and sustain this forever. They need resources to keep it going.
That's right. I think libraries have been super powerful as a community anchor institutions, as a place for folks to get access. And so thanks for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. Janine, I think you got to share a little bit of an anecdote at the beginning. And so I wanted to follow up on something you said about the sort of the work that when you were encountering this lack of access that was inhibiting the work that Fair Count does on the census, on voter registration, on political participation. And you turned to sort of working with Black churches and barbershops. And I think that's so amazing and powerful. Can you talk a little bit about how did that come together, and what do you think are sort of the lessons there for others?
So at Fair Count, we do deep dive organizing, and non-extractive organizing. So our organizers live and work in the communities that we're in, that we work in. And so one of our first partnerships was actually with the 6th Episcopal District of the African Methodist Episcopal, or the AME Church. And when Rebecca DeHart, our CEO, and I had this idea to do these installations, we immediately went to the AME Church and used 25 of their churches as pilots to really work out the kinks. Do we need to hardwire? Do we need do the hotspots? What devices are useful? Do people feel comfortable using an iPad, or do they want a keyboard? Those that we were able to do with this pilot project with the AME Church. And one of my favorite stories that comes out of this actually happened during the pandemic. One of our churches in rural Georgia that was one of our hubs. When the schools closed, and like everybody has said, children did not have access to the internet to do their work. This pastor said that he had dozens of families park outside of his church on a weekly basis just so those kids could get their work done. And then he went on, even at, seeing how effective it was, he actually got additional hotspots and devices to take to boys' homes in the community, so that those students didn't have to leave. They could have those hotspots there so that they could stay in their homes and do their work. And so, the faith community they're trusted voices, and in the community, like they're trusted voices in the community. People listen to faith leaders, and they trust faith leaders and the charity of the church. And so we still work very closely with churches across Georgia and across the nation. And yeah, it's been very, very powerful and rewarding work.
Thanks, Janine. Brenda, I wonder if I can pull you in on this, and I've got a sort of twofer for you. I want to pick up on something we were talking about earlier in your remarks about, just the sheer number, right? Like, I think it was 38% you said of Latinx folks in the United States who lack access. What factors, explain that sort of high rate or low rate of adoption, if you will? And I was curious if there were, do you find sort of similar sort of faith-based institutions are key sort of community institutions for bringing access to the Latinx communities that you work with? Or are there other community institutions that you see as being most effective, most successful? And you're mute.
I keep putting myself on mute. But Janine brought up something very important, that the Latino community and communities of color in general, there is an existing mistrust of government. So it's really important. It's very important to roll out programs with anchor institutions that are trusted by the community, because that means ensuring that the communication is transparent and culturally relevant. So in regards to the election, there was a record-breaking turnout of Latinos who voted in the 2020 election outcome. Data demonstrated that Latino voters were not only crucial in deciding who was the president, but there was a lot of coalition building, and some of the leading organizations like Mi Familia Vota, United We Dream, and other national organizations like ourselves and LULAC and MALDEF, we supported and amplified the message. In the United States, we're the second largest Spanish-speaking country among the world. So there was really good campaigns that came out from Univision and Telemundo. So it's a coalition building. And like I said, that building must be with organizations that are trusted with the community. Why do Latinos lack internet access, or the percentage is so high? For economic reasons, basically can't afford it. And like I said earlier, sometimes it's deciding whether that internet bill is more important than food on the table. We need basic needs. And that's why it's so wonderful right now that we have the EBB program. And I don't know if we're going to touch upon that later on.
Let's come back to EBB
Okay.
in a couple of minutes. But
Okay.
Thanks, Brenda. So Matt, you mentioned this briefly, and I think we're sort of hearing a theme from the other panelists as well, that a lot of times traditional sort of telecom operators, your Verizons or your AT&Ts, those hotspots don't work in a lot of communities, right? Like that traditional operators hasn't gone in there. And the great work that you've done with the Tribal Digital Village network, has really been sort of a different type of provider. And maybe you could sort of talk about like how did it come to be that you sort of built your own network infrastructure, and what do you see as the role of sort of non-traditional operators like that in bringing accessible, affordable access to all?
Sure. Yeah. So the Tribal Digital Village network came about for the specific dynamic that happens around Indian reservations, which is services stop at the border. Even if a tribe is adjacent to a population base that has services, those services stop at the border, because any of the providers that would normally just provide need to work with the tribal government to, move past that line on the ground and actually serve that community and help work with that community. The typical incumbents and the traditionals don't operate that way. They operate, like, this is a giant space that I'm going to serve. I'm just going to, go through and serve what I can serve. Oh, there's an obstacle. Keep moving on the easy, low-hanging fruit. And how many people are over there? Oh, only 1,000, but we have 10,000 in this neighborhood right here. We're just going to focus on that. And it's really driven by the bottom line. It's driven by return on investment. So ROI is always at play when there's deployment. So we're in areas throughout San Diego County, obviously not at the beach. We're east of the center line for the most part. If the county's a big square, split it in half vertically, and so you have right, left. We're on the right. So the services tend to stop as you come into the rural space and get closer to the reservations. There wasn't really any effort to move into this. And now in 2001, we weren't talking broadband, we were talking internet connectivity. So, just the concept of getting internet other than AOL dial-up was new. So that valley lived on AOL dial-up. The unfortunate thing is the phone infrastructure was so old that even during, so we are pretty hot in the summer and off and on rain throughout the year. We get rainstorms that knock out the telephone service, and you wonder why. Well, the cracked housings of all of the cabling because of the heat, that draw water, and then you have a problem. So how do we fix this? Well, it just so happened that there was an opportunity that came along with some technology with wireless out of the UCSD Supercomputer Center. Hans Werner Braun at HP ran data across tribes to get earthquake information to the university as fast as they could to process things. Tribes saw that, they got access to some of that, got a taste of what email and web surfing was locally rather than going somewhere to get it. And a money opportunity came along in a philanthropic effort with Hewlett Packard. It kind of married together and became a thing where conceptually it really became an important tool is when I think the biggest point in tribal space where this mattered the most is when federal grants went to online only at grants.gov. That is effectively excluded all the tribes that didn't have access to now, creeping into what a broadband definition would be to be able to manage an online application and upload files. That really shocked our system because tribes, being sovereign dependents of the federal government, are dependent on grants and subsidies for the most part if they don't have their own economic development in place. They're all working on some sort of economic development to try to be self-sustaining, but they are dependents of the Fed. So they need that pathway. And previously it was FedEx and the USPS, Express Mail, and then grants.gov happened and the world changed. Everybody had to have broadband because we weren't going to be able to function. So then there was a huge shift on how do I get the tribal office at least in some sort of a connection. So the non-traditional method of, okay, we're going to build it ourselves. What does that mean? Kind of rippled through the tribal communities. And those of us that started as early as 2001 and maybe even some before that I don't know of, became sort of like the example pool of, hey, let's go down and visit the Tribal Digital Village Network because they've done this. Maybe we can do this. And one of my favorite pictures that we have, just somebody snapped it while we were doing a demonstration and stuff. We had a meeting for that Federal Communications Commission. They came out to TDV to see the network. We took them up a mountain, 6 miles up a mountain, and we were all standing around the communications tower that runs on solar power that's off grid completely, looking down into the valleys at 3 reservations. And standing on one of the boxes is Valerie Fasthorse, the IT director for Coeur d'Alene Tribe. And Valerie has a technology background from the military, from the Army, and she is in communications. And she stood there and she looked at all the reservations and she looked at our tower and she goes, "You're kidding me. You can do this with Wi-Fi?" And went home and built a network called Red Spectrum that makes us look like a hobby. And it's amazing. So it started to spawn and grow throughout, and tribes are sharing with each other the opportunities and the methods. And I'll tell you 50 ways how not to build a network so that you don't have to make those mistakes and you're stretch your dollar.
That's going to be another panel that we'll run later this year. We'll take you up on that, Matt. But it's always amazing, like these fateful forks in the road, right? Where it's like that decision to move, to grants.gov and sort of the cascading effects of that. But it's also so inspiring that the infrastructure you've actually built where no one else was coming. But I want to pick up on something you put into the chat about sort of the role of libraries in sort of sharing Wi-Fi access points and in distribution points. And Ray, maybe you can tell us a little bit more, like how operationally does this work? Are there things that are like replicable here that folks can be doing? And I want to go next to sort of some of the federal funding that you sort of also started to pick up on. Is this being supported? Is there more support that's needed for these kinds of programs? But what is really the role? I think sometimes when we talk about connectivity, we just talk about like fiber and towers and conduit, and we ignore all the other things that go into actually bringing people to meaningfully have access to the internet, to really be able to use the internet to better their lives.
Yeah, I think building on some of the conversations we had said about trusting institutions, and libraries are, for one of the most trusted institutions because they're the space that provides community support and engagement. And I think because when we know and recognize that libraries are places that people just draw to, whether it's for internet access or for other opportunities, they tend to like listen and follow through. And I think as a result, there needs to be more center on partnerships, right? Like I was saying earlier, because they can't necessarily just do it on their own with the existing constraints that exist for that impacts the communities that they serve. So we're thinking about obviously the issue of cost. Like Brenda mentioned earlier, that's always going to be an issue for libraries to think about how do you scale up, especially during COVID. And so even during that time, it was cobbling around these different solutions. But is it sustainable? Probably not. But through partnerships and thinking about how to reconfigure support within the libraries. So obviously cost is a matter to think about, but also people. How do we get more people to support and provide training? And whether that is teaching people technology skills in Spanish or in Arabic or in Mandarin Chinese, different languages to engage. And this is where libraries are really good at, because people from different communities of color and immigrant groups might go to the libraries to get that support. So I think for all the organizations that we're referring to, definitely partner with libraries to think about how to reach out to such communities, because the libraries are the source. Now, with that being said, I also wanted to add that it is quite attractive, right? Because libraries have that socialization space, and people are attracted because they can bring their family, their children, and all of that, and engage and learn technology skills. But it's also important to recognize that we play an important role in supporting this incredible work that everyone's trying to do, in a sense that should be considered broadband as a human right. So the American Library Association in January passed a resolution to acknowledge that it is a fundamental human right. So alongside, it's a fabric of infrastructure. Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe different organizations also need to recognize that and partner with their libraries, because the American Library Association also recognizes this as a fundamental need.
Thanks, Ray.
Can I just add there? Yeah, about a year ago, the Consumer Report Survey revealed that 4 out of 5 Americans agree that internet service is as important as water and electricity. So just think about that for a second. As important as water. We have to have water. I have to have water every day. So, I think that digital equity, we have to make sure that everyone has the device, affordable access to speed internet service, and the digital literacy. And it's so important. And Ray, I remember being just going to graduate from high school. And my father says, I never went to college, but I want you to go to college. I want you to have a future. So I'm going to take you to the library. What I can't give you, the library is going to be there for you. It's going to have the knowledge. It's going to tell you how to apply for colleges, the scholarships that are out there. And I lived in East LA at the time. It was the Chicano Resource Center. So libraries are so important for our young people. That's where we go. And it is a trusted anchor institution in our neighborhoods.
Absolutely. So Brenda, I want to get into some of this federal funding sort of question. And I think this is that opportunity for the federal government to really sort of put the kind of dollars that are needed if we are really going to treat the internet on the same level as water or power. And so I think, in regards to the Latino communities, like with all of this federal funding that's coming down, what are you most excited about? What are you most concerned about?
Okay, so one of the big efforts that NHMC is very proud to have been a part of right now is the $3.2 billion emergency broadband benefit that launched last week. And we work closely with the FCC. And the EBB is a temporary program at the FCC where government is offering $50 discount for eligible households. And in addition, a one-time discount of up to $100 is available to a household for the purchase of a laptop, desktop, computer. And the funding is limited, so we encourage right now people to apply. We want to see this, we see this as a huge step forward in the narrative that access to internet is a human right. So we're hoping that this program will be extended and that it will be a model for a long-term non-emergency subsidy program that helps all low-income families have affordable access to the internet at home. So this is something we're particularly very happy about. And one thing that we really worked on is that when you're applying, you don't have to use a social security number. You can use other forms of identification. So we wanted to make sure that many of the undocumented or documented immigrants were able to apply because they've been completely locked out of COVID-19 financial relief. So the EBB accepts many forms of identification: driver's license, military ID, passport, taxpayer identification number, tribal ID, and of course, social security or any other government ID. It's very simple. You just go to online. There's a phone number you can call, and I can share that on the chat. But we're really excited about this, and I think it'll be a model for, like I said, a long-term plan.
Mm-hmm. So I think, absolutely EBB is delivering critical support to Americans, across the country. And, but if Jean, and even one of the things that you and I have talked about is also how do we, and Brenda was sort of saying this, how do we get to sort of permanent infrastructure, right? How do we make sure that this isn't just a temporary, sort of amount of support that's going to folks, but how do we actually, what's it going to take to make sure all these federal dollars are actually going into building new infrastructure in currently underserved communities?
Yeah, well, one, I'm excited about all the money that's coming in through the EEB program or EBB program, and also all the federal dollars that are going to state and local governments. I think that if anything, what I'm concerned about is one, that is temporary. So I know that there are several, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of policy changes or ideas and policy proposals is the Lewis Latimer plan that was put out by the, I think it's the Lewis Racial Equity and Inclusion Plan. But they have a lot of different initiatives outlined in that plan that really focus on racial equity and digital access. And so I think looking at that and the government, federal government building off of that. The other thing is the next time money comes, there needs to be more guidance for, governments, local, state and local governments about how to use these funds. And there should be funds that are specifically earmarked for broadband. Now you have billions of dollars coming out of the American Rescue Plan, but a paucity of actual, earmarked funds. And so anything else that comes through, you need to be able to, I don't want to say force, but in certain communities, when money comes through, your priorities, if broadband for everybody in your community is not an issue, you're going to put that money somewhere else, and it's going to continue to be a problem. And so I would think that any future policies, any future funding that comes to these communities should have earmarked funds specifically for broadband to really force communities to think about why it's important and what they can do to develop long-term solutions.
Absolutely. And so, Matt, I wonder if we can pull you in here, because there has been some dedicated funding, certainly for tribal communities, including an announcement from NTIA today around this. And so can you tell us a little bit about that announcement? And, also, we're seeing this dedicated cash, we're seeing dedicated spectrum as well on tribal lands. Like, is this enough, or what more is needed to really bridge the gap and bring access to everyone on tribal communities?
So so we're excited, obviously, whenever there's money that says tribes and broadband together on it, we're pretty excited. It's the first time we're seeing this much money flow. Jeffrey Blackwell and I are co-chairs of the Tech and Telecom Subcommittee at the National Congress of American Indians, and along with a lot of intertribals as well as tribal organizations, we've been pushing for a $1 billion foundational start to support tribes in building broadband for their own communities. And, you know, we are now seeing that number come to fruition through the Second CARES Act Fund, and will be announced this summer, as we're told, through NTIA. Today, they announced a portion of a sort of an adjacent fund of about $288 million that allows the state to partner with private industry to serve a tribal community, potentially to build middle mile, but that it has to have a last mile solution engaged as well. So that announced today. So the rules are out and the application window is open. We're excited there because that's enticing folks to build where there's probably not enough return on investment to build to a community with middle mile fiber, unless there's some sort of a subsidy or support for that. These are ways for those projects to get built out. And there's a massive deficit in the United States of middle mile connection to the rest of the network from tribal reservations. As I was working with the Obama administration in the last year of his second term, we identified 8,000 missing middle miles to connect tribes to the closest fiber opportunity. So that is quite a big chunk of mileage to cover, and, you know, has a price tag of its own of, you know, reaching close to $1 billion. So with $1 billion coming out of NTIA for tribes to build networks this summer, you know, that's a foundational start. We did a lot of desktop engineering during that timeline, and the ballpark is somewhere in the $7 billion range to support tribes in connecting all of their communities. So very happy about a solid foundational start. It will also inform the future of how far people have been building on their own, how much traction they've gotten in the time where things have not been accounted for or recorded. Now there's going to be submissions of plans and different opportunities, and we'll see really what $1 billion does. Is there still a $6 billion gap, or have we eaten away at that over the last, you know, 5-6 years?
Mm-hmm. And do you think that tribal communities are ready to sort of access all of this money, and or do you think there's more support that's going to be needed to really sort of make the most of this opportunity?
So I told the White House, this White House, that there's never been a time where tribes are going to see the largest deficit of trustable partners when $1 billion hits the street, right? So tribes will need partners to be able to function in this space. There are several tribes, you know, there's 574 federally recognized tribes. There's at least 100 of those tribes that are ready to go, just ready to go today, giving the money we're already building. There's probably another 200 that are very, very engaged and have a plan and a feasibility study and ready to move. And, you know, then there's, you know, the waning tiers of hundreds left that are in various stages of development and understanding of what that might look like if they manage it themselves, and what that means for their future. And are they going to will they have the human capacity and resources to be able to manage that internally, or do they need to partner?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're concerned. It's because the sharks have already hit the water with the announcements before money has flown out the door. They are already partnering with tribes to try to say that, look, we'll walk you through this process. We'll help you apply for that money so that you get your fair share. And it's, you know, a Silicon Valley perspective, it's a private consulting firm perspective, it's a money grab perspective, and it's complicated. A lot of the issues around some of the tribes that are just getting their feet wet in this, and you know, so we have some concerns there.
Well, I'm glad you're on the job, Matt, as always, and let's keep talking about how we can support those folks. I feel like I could ask this great group of folks questions for hours, but I do want to give some of the audience questions that we've received. And so, with respect to the EBB, are we seeing any loosening of the restrictions for libraries and schools to keep Wi-Fi on and to expand to communities near schools and libraries? And maybe Ray, I'll serve that up to you first, but then anyone else who wants to jump in.
Yeah, maybe other folks can jump in first. I had to think about this for a second. Yeah.
Brenda, you have a thought on this? Are we seeing any loosening of the restrictions for libraries and schools to keep Wi-Fi on?
I feel that there is a need to keep the Wi-Fi on, and we have to expand the hours, we have to expand the personnel, because parking lots are where people are learning and doing their homework and whatnot. But yeah.
I have a quick thing in there. The tribal libraries are starting to open up in San Diego County a little bit, limited usage and stuff for students, but as the schools open as well, we definitely need to keep the Wi-Fi going, because the opportunity for folks to come up and use the internet for a specific, moment in time, they know they have an access point that they can go to always, even if it's not, directly related to a child performing a school function. It's like, hey, I need Wi-Fi today to do this, or to do a job application, or to do something. There is actually a functional space then that they can go and not engage with other people. There's also a split in our communities that, some support vaccination and some don't. There's a horrible history of tribal people being misused in the medical field, and a lot of people carry that to today and may not get vaccinated. So they're choosing to stay away from the general, crowds and such. And this gives them an opportunity to still participate, and not have to get out of the car and go into the library itself during these weird conditions. So I think that's highly valuable. And we don't want to see any of the opportunities that have been created shrink away. Just like we don't want the mindsets to close back down on what's available and what should be allowed after COVID stops, because we're in a different space, a better space. So if we can add all the cool things that we've done during COVID to solve problems to all the normal things that we used to do, then we have, a much greater opportunity moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to. Go ahead.
Well, the one thing I was going to say, it's not with and Brenda, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not with with the EBB program, but as a part of the American Rescue Act. I think there is funding that is earmarked for libraries and schools to basically refund or fund continued Wi-Fi, basically for them to provide a continued Wi-Fi access to communities. And I think there is something with one of the policies that's actually allowing them to go further into communities, or encourage them to go further into communities outside of the school, outside of the library. So I can look that up. I think I read it last night, but I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say briefly, building on the comments made earlier, that remote working and remote learning is not going away. It's still going to be with us, for a while, and people have opted in for that. So there are going to be telehealth, people applying for jobs online, and all this other need to ensure safety guidelines, right? As we're sort of figuring out how COVID is being managed. So it also, I think, could create an opportunity to decrease the cost potentially by looking at how federal government is providing these direct payments. So for libraries and the communities they serve.
If I can just touch on something Matt talked about, because it's so important and it has to do with the internet. There's been a lot of, we talked about the mistrust in communities of color, right, on government. And Matt mentioned the vaccines. And, even in my household or immediate family, people think differently, and there's some mistrust there. So I just want to say how important it is. And that has to do with a lot of the disinformation that's online about the vaccine. So I just want to take the opportunity to say, I encourage all the Latino and POC community we're the examples here, and I'm fully vaccinated, and I got vaccinated because I love myself and I love others. So everybody get out there, get vaccinated, love thyself, love the community, let's be strong and united once again.
Absolutely. I wonder if, in closing, I could ask each of you, if you had a magic wand and could do one thing to accelerate the rate at which people, communities of color are connecting to the internet, what would it be?
I can start.
Yeah, please.
I think mine would be a magic wand that would make everyone in the world and in the country and digitally literate. You've heard other panelists have talked about it. We can give people, everybody has access to the internet, but if they don't know how to use it, it's doing people, it's a disservice. And so I think we really need to focus on making sure that people, and I think a lot of times when people think about digital literacy, they think a lot about older people not knowing how to use it, or parents not knowing how to use, my grandparents. But there are young folks that know how to use a phone, know how to use an app, but don't know how to set up an email address or know how to apply for a job online. And so I think my magic wand would make sure that everyone had access to digital literacy courses so that they could take full advantage of all the internet that Connect Humanity is going to bring to everybody.
So Janine, mine's a big one. So I'm going to say yes to digital literacy. Yes to every human being having a device around the world, and yes to affordable broadband access.
Yeah, I was going to say universal internet access and what that looks like in terms of enabling infrastructure for people to have access. We know that there are people who will not want to be connected for whatever reason. And sometimes it's purposeful and sometimes it's unintentional. And I think we need to acknowledge that. But also that also means that I actually don't know whether the digital divide could actually be closed, because some people just opt not to, for privacy reasons, for cost, because they're relying on their public libraries and things like that. But it is a policy issue, right? At least creating an infrastructure that people can choose to have agency to decide if they want to have access or not is what I am thinking of.
So I would like to take all of those answers and just stand on top of all of them because they're brilliant. And I would have said most everything that has been said and just stand above and say, and I'm going to answer one of the questions in the chat with this, the digital literacy piece, the understanding of what the internet means, the dangers of the internet, the benefits of the internet, managing your digital footprint, right? What do you want to leave behind on the internet? These have been things that I've been dealing with cultural leaders and tribal leaders and educational leaders in the tribal community for 20 years. And it started out and made a big shift. It started out where people were, we don't want internet in our community because it's bad. There's all kinds of horrible things there that we don't want our kids to fall into these traps. There's all kinds of content that we don't want them to see. And then there's predators that are out there. And then we got into the situation where, hey, this digital tool is kind of interesting for language preservation. How do we use that, without, all the other stuff that we don't want to deal with? And then I had conversations then about digital literacy and understanding what you were doing. And it's very a delicate space because you're essentially telling people how to parent, right? So if you are concerned about your child using the internet, be involved in their use of the internet. And that's how you know what's going on the internet, and set times and work with them and understanding. So that was an educational process, walking on eggshells so that we didn't offend. And then there was a huge dynamic shift. So I started and 26 kids graduated the first year I was at Tribal Chairman's Association. We have a graduation ceremony, collects all the high school graduates in the tribal region that we're in, and they have a ceremony. 2019 was like 154. Same population base. So we have an increased amount of graduates. Technology has played a big role in that. Access to internet has played a big role in that, in making up classes and after school resource programs, helping study, access to resources and such. Now what's happening is they're going on to higher education and they're not coming home because they can't perform the degree that they just learned at higher education in their community. Now the cultural leaders are coming to me and saying, how do you get more broadband accessible to our community so we can bring home our brain trust that went away and learned all this stuff that could really benefit our community at home? How do we bring them home? How do you make it so that they can do their jobs here? because we know there's telecommuting. We know there's an opportunity for them to work for some of these corporations in our community, but we want them to come home. Can you help us do that? So there has been a big dynamic shift over a long period of time over these issues. And, you know, if there was anything I could say is that, you know, ubiquitous broadband coverage for everyone and the knowledge to use it.
Thank you all. Amen to that. And so thanks for a fantastic conversation. I do want to acknowledge there were a couple of questions that we didn't have time for, but I think that's generally a sign that there was a good conversation and more to come. Shameless plug, if you want to hear about more of these kinds of events, you can sign up for our mailing list at on our website, connecthumanity.fund. Or shoot us an email at info@connecthumanity.fund. And so thanks again to our panelists. Yeah.
Can I add, please share my email address with anybody who requests it. I'm more than happy to answer some of these questions offline.
I'm happy to do that and happy to connect anyone with Matt who feels so inclined. And we'll send out some information about all the great organizations that you heard from today soon. And so thanks again. And thanks Janine and Faircount for co-sponsoring with us. And thanks everyone for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, evening, wherever you might be.
Thank you, Yohai.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.